We were buried alive in the sands of Morocco. Our crime was accepting Jesus, and our sentence was death. But before we were killed, heaven spoke. I will never forget that day in the desert. The air was so dry it scorched my lungs, and the sun burned against my skin like open flame. I remember thinking, this is how it ends for us. Buried up to our necks in the sand, waiting for death. But what happened next shattered everything I thought I knew about God, about fear, and about what true faith really means. My name is Nabil, and if you're listening, it's because God still brings life out of the sand. I am 19 years old. I was born and raised in a quiet village near Arakidia in southeastern Morocco, where dusty roads wind through olive groves and time feels like it moves slower than the rest of the world. Life in our village is simple and deeply religious. My father is the imam of the mosque in our community, a man known for his strong voice, wise teachings, and strict devotion to Islam. In our home, the Quran was treated with the highest respect. I was taught from a young age that questioning our faith was not only disrespectful but dangerous. By the time I was 10, I could recite long passages of the Quran from memory. My parents were proud of me. I prayed 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan, and followed every rule I was taught. I believed I was doing everything right, until one afternoon changed everything. It happened on a hot Thursday in early spring. I was walking through the market in the center of town, just like I had done hundreds of times before. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just passing time after helping my father clean the mosque courtyard. That's when I saw him. A man, maybe in his late 30s, standing near a stall selling dates and figs. He didn't look like a tourist, but he didn't look like one of us either. His skin was darker, and his clothes were simple but clean. What caught my attention was the way he was speaking to an older man. His tone was calm, not forceful, but I could hear a few words that made me stop walking. He said something about Isa Jesus, and love that forgives. That alone was strange. We are taught that Jesus is a prophet, nothing more. But this man, he spoke differently, like he knew him personally. I paused by the edge of the stall, pretending to look at some dried apricots, but my ears were focused on their conversation. The older man didn't seem interested and walked away. The stranger turned and looked directly at me. For a moment, I thought about leaving. I knew I shouldn't be listening to people talk about religion that wasn't Islam. But then he smiled and said quietly, "Do you know why Isa came?" I froze. I had never been asked a question like that. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe to defend what I was taught, but nothing came out. Instead, I asked, "What do you mean?" The man stepped closer and said gently, "He came to give life, not rules." Before I could respond, he handed me a small folded paper and said, "Read this when you are alone." Then he turned and walked away like nothing happened. My heart was racing. I quickly tucked the paper into my pocket and left the market. That night, after dinner and evening prayer, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The words he said kept echoing in my mind. He came to give life, not rules. What did that mean? Islam had always been about rules: prayers, fasting, cleanliness, obedience. I sat up and took the paper from my pocket. It was a small printed note with just a few lines. Jesus is not only a prophet. He is the Son of God who died and rose again to give you life. Read the Injil, New Testament, and find out for yourself. My hands trembled. My first instinct was to tear it up. This was dangerous. If my father found it, I would be in serious trouble. But I didn't tear it. I stared at those words until I could hear them in my head without looking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering, what if it was true? The next few days passed slowly. I avoided the market, afraid I might see the man again. But deep inside, I was curious, more than curious. I needed to know more. But how? There was no church in our village, and asking questions about Christianity could cause rumors, even arrest. Then I remembered the old medina on the edge of town, a place where merchants from different regions came to sell their goods. Some of them were foreigners, and it was known for having things that were hard to find. The next day, I made up an excuse to go there. I wandered through the narrow alleys until I reached a small bookstall hidden between a spice shop and a carpet weaver. I asked the man quietly if he had any books about Isa in French or Arabic. He looked at me for a moment, then turned and pulled out a thin, worn book wrapped in cloth. "Keep it hidden," he said, "and don't come back here asking again." I walked home with the book hidden under my shirt, my heart pounding with every step. I felt like I was doing something criminal, though I hadn't even opened it yet. That night, when everyone was asleep, I lit the small lamp beside my bed and unwrapped the cloth. The book was a French-Arabic copy of the New Testament. I had never seen anything like it. I opened to the first page and started reading the Gospel of Matthew. At first, I was confused. There were names I didn't recognize and stories that didn't make sense. But then I read about Jesus healing people, feeding the hungry, and speaking about love, not just for friends, but for enemies. His words were simple, but they felt powerful. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I read that verse over and over. It felt like someone was speaking directly to me through the page. For weeks, I read in secret every night. I would wait until everyone had gone to sleep, then quietly open the New Testament and continue reading. The more I read, the more I began to feel something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just information, it was like the words were alive. They didn't speak about fear or punishment, but love, mercy, and a God who wanted to be close to us, not far away. I started to compare what I had always known to what I was now discovering. In Islam, I had always tried to be good enough, afraid that any small mistake might anger Allah. But this Jesus spoke of grace, something I didn't have to earn. I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing. I kept my Bible wrapped in the same cloth and hid it inside a wooden box under my bed. But every night, I opened it with trembling hands, hungry to know more. One night, I came to the story of Jesus on the cross. I had heard before that Christians believed he died, but I never understood why. Now, reading it for myself, something inside me broke. The way he forgave the people who were killing him. The way he cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." I couldn't hold back my tears. This didn't sound like a prophet, it sounded like someone greater. That night, I closed the book and sat in silence. My whole body felt heavy, like I was carrying a weight I never noticed before. And then I whispered, "If you are real, if you really are the Son of God, I want to know you." It was not a perfect prayer. I didn't know how to speak to Jesus properly. But something happened in that moment. A strange peace came over me. I didn't understand it, but I knew my life had just begun to change. After the night I first prayed to Jesus, everything inside me started to shift. I still followed my daily routines, going to the mosque, helping my father, reciting verses of the Quran, but none of it felt the same anymore. I wasn't trying to disrespect my family or my religion. I just felt like I had found something deeper. At night, I continued to read the New Testament, and each time, the words touched something in me that had never been touched before. I longed to talk to someone about it, someone who understood. I felt completely alone. Then, one early morning while walking through the back streets near the edge of the village, I saw a small cross drawn on a cracked wall behind an old storage shed. It was faint, but I knew what it meant. I returned the next morning and waited. That's how I met the people who would change my life forever. The first person to approach me was a boy named Zaid. He looked young, maybe 16, with sharp eyes and quiet confidence. He walked up, looked me in the eye, and asked, "Are you searching?" I didn't need to ask what he meant. I nodded. Without saying anything more, he handed me a note and walked away. The note had simple directions scribbled on it, coordinates and a time, before sunrise. Come alone. The next day, I followed the directions across narrow roads and rocky trails until I reached the edge of the Atlas Mountains. There, hidden between jagged rocks and dry trees, was an old abandoned farmhouse. Its walls were cracked, and the wooden door hung loosely on one hinge. It looked forgotten by the world, but as I stepped inside quietly, I felt something alive. The air was still, but I could hear faint whispers. In one corner of the room, 4 young people sat on a blanket, praying in silence. One of them looked up and smiled. She was a girl around my age with deep brown eyes and a soft but steady voice. "You must be Nabil," she said. "We've been waiting for you." Her name was Layla. She was 17 and had grown up in a nearby village. Next to her sat Rami, the oldest of the group at 21. He was tall, strong, and carried himself like someone who had seen hard things but still stood tall. Salma was 18, soft-spoken and kind, always watching and listening before speaking. Zaid, the boy who found me, was the youngest. Despite his age, he spoke with boldness and certainty. I joined them on the blanket, unsure of what to expect. They sang softly, simple songs in Arabic about God's love, freedom, and peace. Rami opened a small Bible and read a few verses, then we all prayed. No one raised their voice. Everything was quiet, careful, and sacred. That morning was the first time I didn't feel alone. I had found people who believed what I believed, who had experienced the same fear and longing. After we prayed, we talked. I told them my story, how I had met the stranger in the market and found the New Testament. Layla shared how she had been introduced to Jesus by her cousin in Marrakesh before he was arrested. Rami had found faith while studying abroad and returned to Morocco to help others find the truth. Salma had secretly followed Jesus for a year without anyone knowing. Zaid's story was the most surprising. He had been caught with a Bible at school and beaten by his uncle, yet he never turned back. Each of us had come from different places, but somehow, we had all ended up in this small, crumbling farmhouse on the side of a mountain. We didn't need a fancy building. We had each other, and we had Jesus. We began meeting every morning before sunrise. Always the same place. Always the same routine. We would gather quietly, pray in whispers, read from the Bible, and sing softly. Rami taught us how to study scripture, and Layla often led the singing. Sometimes we shared small pieces of bread and water, remembering the sacrifice of Jesus. We were careful, no phones, no loud voices, and always keeping watch. Zaid would stand near the entrance, listening for footsteps or anything unusual. It was risky. We all knew that. In Morocco, converting from Islam to Christianity is not just a personal decision. It's seen as betrayal, shameful to the family, and punishable by law. If caught, we could be arrested, beaten, or worse. Still, we came. Something about being together made us braver. We encouraged one another. Each gathering filled us with peace, even as the danger around us grew. After a few weeks, I began to notice strange things. A man from my village started asking me questions about where I went so early in the morning. He said he saw me walking toward the mountains several times. I tried to act normal, but I could feel his suspicion. Another day, Layla said someone had been following her after market day. We decided to start changing our routes and meeting times. Rami reminded us to stay prayerful and calm. They watched Jesus too, he said, but the truth didn't stop shining. We took extra care. No one spoke about the gatherings in public. Salma started bringing a small notebook with codes instead of names or verses. But still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One morning, we arrived at the farmhouse and saw the door slightly open. Zaid was sure he had closed it tightly the day before. We searched the area, but found nothing. Still, the warning signs were there. One morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, and the air was cold. I waited outside for the others. As I stood there, I noticed something that made my heart drop. Fresh footprints in the dirt, not just ours, but several others, leading from the trees to the back of the farmhouse. I quietly knocked on the door in our usual pattern, and Rami let me in. I told him what I saw. His face grew serious. "Let's not stay too long today," he said. The rest of the group arrived, and we carried on as usual, but we were nervous. Every sound made us jump. That morning, we didn't sing. We just prayed. Rami read from Matthew 10, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul." Those words stayed in my mind all day. Something was coming, we could all feel it, but we didn't know when. 3 days later, it happened. We met at our usual time, just before the first light broke over the mountains. We entered quietly, closed the door, and began to pray. Rami read a passage about Paul and Silas in prison, and Zaid smiled as he whispered, "Even in chains, they worshipped." Layla began singing softly, the same song we always sang at the end of each gathering, "Jesus, my peace, my strength in the storm." Just as we started singing, the silence outside broke. A loud crash slammed against the door, and shouts echoed through the farmhouse. Before we could react, armed men burst in, 3 of them in uniform, shouting for us to get on the ground. One of them pointed a flashlight in my face, blinding me. "Don't move," he screamed. Another officer grabbed Rami and pushed him against the wall. I saw Layla fall to her knees, trembling. Zaid raised his hands without saying a word. We didn't fight. We didn't run. We froze. Everything we had feared was now real. One of the officers began searching the room, kicking over blankets and checking under floorboards. They found Rami's Bible and held it up like it was a weapon. "You are preaching a forbidden religion," one of them said. "You are trying to convert Muslims." I wanted to speak, to explain that we weren't hurting anyone, that we were just praying. But no words came out. I looked at Salma, who was whispering a prayer with her eyes closed. The officer pointed to her and shouted, "Stop that now!" But she didn't stop. Another officer grabbed Layla roughly by the arm and dragged her toward the door. "We have orders to take all of you," he said. Rami looked at us and said calmly, "Do not be afraid. God is with us." His voice, though soft, gave me a strength I didn't expect. They forced us outside into the cold morning. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the mountains. I had always loved that view, but that day it felt distant, like it belonged to another world. We were pushed into the back of a dark truck. No windows, just metal walls and the sound of boots on gravel. I sat between Zaid and Rami. None of us spoke. The truck began to move, and with each mile, the fear grew heavier. I didn't know where they were taking us or what would happen next. My hands were shaking, and my mind raced with questions. Would my family find out? Would I be sent to prison? Would I ever see the others again? Then I heard Layla's voice, quiet but steady. She was singing again. "Jesus, my peace." The same words we had sung minutes before. One by one, we joined her. In that truck, with chains on our hands and fear in our hearts, we worshipped. The journey in the dark truck seemed to last forever. None of us spoke much. Every now and then, I could hear the sound of metal chains moving or the low hum of the engine. We didn't know where we were going, but after hours of silence, the air began to feel drier, hotter. The road turned rough, and the truck rattled loudly as we moved further away from everything we knew. I could feel the heat rising through the metal walls. The smell of sand and sweat filled the space. Then the vehicle came to a hard stop. The back doors opened with a loud creak, and a burst of hot wind slapped my face. One of the guards shouted at us to get out. As I stepped down, the sun blinded me. We were somewhere in the desert, flat land, endless dunes, and nothing else. No towns, no homes. Just sand, sky, and silence. One by one, we were lined up beside the truck. Layla squinted against the sun. Salma had tears in her eyes but said nothing. Rami stood tall as always. Zaid looked younger than ever in that moment, but his hands were steady. Then, without warning, one of the men pulled out a piece of cloth and tied it tightly around my eyes. I heard the others being blindfolded too. Everything went black. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I felt a sharp push on my shoulder, and someone barked, "Walk." Sand crunched beneath my feet. I stumbled as they guided us forward, the heat already burning through my shoes. We walked for what felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Finally, I was forced to my knees. Hands grabbed my arms roughly and held me in place. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something terrible was coming. The blindfold was ripped from my eyes. The light stabbed through my pupils, but I adjusted. In front of me, 5 shallow holes had been dug in the sand, just big enough for a human body. The guards stood nearby, armed and sweating. Behind them, 2 men who weren't in uniform watched silently. They wore traditional clothing and carried nothing but small notebooks. One of them stepped forward and said, You have a final chance. Deny your new faith. Return to Islam, and we will let you walk away alive." No one answered. I looked around at the others. Layla's lips were pressed tight. Rami shook his head slowly. Salma stared at the ground, her eyes filled with peace. Zaid whispered something I couldn't hear. The man turned to me and said, "You're the Imam's son. You know better than this. Say the words, and this ends now." My throat was dry, but I spoke clearly. "I will not deny Jesus." The man sighed and turned to the guards. "Begin." Immediately, we were grabbed again. I felt hands shoving me into the hole. My legs were folded, my arms forced behind me. Sand was piled around my body, up to my chest, then to my shoulders. It was dry, rough, and painfully hot. I could feel the heat rising from the ground, burning into my skin. The more they packed the sand, the harder it became to breathe. When they were done, only my neck and head were above the surface. I couldn't move. I couldn't even lift my chin. I looked to my left and saw Layla buried like me, her face covered in sweat. Zaid was to my right, his lips moving in silent prayer. The guards stepped back and stood under a tent they had set up for shade. One of them took a long drink from a bottle and laughed. Let's see how long they last. The sun climbed higher. Its heat pressed down on us like a heavy hand. The sand around me felt like fire. My skin burned. Sweat dripped into my eyes and down my neck. My lips cracked from dryness. I tried not to move. Every movement sent small shocks of pain through my body. I thought about my father. I wondered what he would say if he saw me now. I wondered if he would feel shame or sorrow. But more than anything, I wondered if God still saw us. I tried to pray, but my thoughts were jumbled. Then I heard a sound, soft and trembling. It was Layla. She was singing. Her voice was weak but clear. "Jesus, my peace, my hope in the fire." The song we always sang at the farmhouse. One by one, we all joined in. Salma's voice, Rami's deep tone, Zaid's youthful hum, and finally my own. Our worship rose through the dry air. The guards were confused. Some laughed. One of them shouted, "You're dying and still singing?" Another walked over and kicked the sand near Zaid's face. "Sing louder then. Let your Jesus save you." But we didn't stop. We weren't singing to escape. We were singing because we believed he was still with us. And that belief was stronger than the heat, stronger than the fear. As the song continued, something strange began to happen. The burning sensation on my skin started to ease. I blinked and realized my cheeks didn't sting as much. The sand around my shoulders didn't feel like fire anymore. I looked at Rami. His eyes were closed, and his face looked calmer than before. I glanced at Zaid. He gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "Do you feel it too?" I didn't want to believe it at first, but the truth was clear. The sand was cooling beneath us. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mind, maybe exhaustion or a sign I was about to faint. But the more I focused, the more real it became. The heat that had once felt unbearable was now tolerable. The sand that had burned my skin now felt cold, almost refreshing. The guards noticed it too. One of them walked over and touched the ground near Layla's neck. I saw his eyes widen. He stood up quickly and backed away. "It's cold," he said. "The sand, it's cold." The others laughed at him, but then they checked it themselves. I watched as confusion spread across their faces. One of them kicked the sand again and cursed under his breath. "This isn't possible," he said. The man who had threatened us earlier said nothing. He looked at us with suspicion, like he was seeing something he couldn't explain. But we didn't say anything. We just kept singing. Each verse we sang felt stronger than the one before. Our voices didn't come from strength, but from faith. We were still trapped, still helpless in the eyes of the world, but inside, something was rising. I felt peace, real peace, like never before. Even with death all around us, I wasn't afraid anymore. I could feel God's presence in the silence, in the coolness of the sand, in the unity of our voices. Rami began to speak softly, quoting scripture, Even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, Salma whispered. You are my refuge, my fortress. Zaid said nothing, but tears ran down his face. I knew they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of worship. The guards stepped back under their tent, now clearly shaken. Some were whispering to each other, looking over their shoulders like they expected something else to happen. None of them could explain what they were witnessing. Time moved slowly. The sun reached its peak and then began to lower. Hours passed, but we were still alive. No one had fainted. No one had begged for mercy. We sang, we prayed, and we endured. At one point, a bird flew overhead and landed nearby, unafraid. I took it as a sign. I remembered what Jesus said, not even a sparrow falls without your Father knowing. I knew then we were not forgotten. Even here, buried in the middle of nowhere, God saw us. God was with us. The air began to shift. The wind, which had been still all day, began to move. It started as a light breeze but grew stronger. Dust swirled in the distance. One of the guards stood up and looked at the sky. There's nothing in the forecast, he said. But the wind didn't stop. In fact, it began to rise higher, like something powerful was coming across the desert. The sky, which had been perfectly clear all day, started to darken slightly. Not with clouds, but with dust carried by the wind. The guards looked unsettled. One of them covered his face with a scarf. This is not normal, he said. I felt the sand shifting slightly around my neck. Not enough to free me, but enough to notice. A strange feeling filled the air, not fear, not danger, but something bigger. Like the earth itself was preparing to speak. Layla looked up, her hair whipping across her face. She didn't say anything, but I saw the awe in her eyes. Rami closed his eyes and began to pray quietly, thanking God for being near. Then, far in the distance, we heard it, a deep, low rumble. Thunder. In the middle of a cloudless desert sky. Zaid looked up, his face shining with wonder. It's beginning, he said. We didn't know what was coming, but we knew God was not finished yet. The sound of thunder echoed again, louder this time, shaking something deep in my chest. We all looked up. The sky above us was still mostly clear, but the wind had become stronger, wilder. Dust and sand began lifting from the ground and swirling through the air like tiny whirlpools. The guards stopped talking. One of them shouted for the others to get inside the tent. Another cursed and grabbed his scarf to shield his face. I watched the clouds of sand begin to move faster, turning the golden desert into a dull brown haze. It was hard to believe this was real. There were no storms in the forecast. No rain. No signs of this just an hour earlier. But now the wind screamed across the dunes, howling like something alive. It wasn't just a storm, it felt like a force sent with a purpose. And somehow, deep inside, I knew it had come for us. As the storm grew stronger, the air around me seemed to change. I no longer felt the weight of the sun on my skin. The coolness that had begun earlier now surrounded me completely. It was like the sand itself had turned soft, no longer burning, no longer pressing against my chest with the same force. I looked over at Zaid, just a few feet away, and saw his eyes wide with amazement. Nabil, he shouted above the wind, the sand is moving. I felt it too. The grains beneath my shoulders and neck were shifting, not blowing away, but loosening, falling, like something was digging from beneath. I pushed my hands against the sand. To my shock, they moved. Not much, but more than before. My wrists, which had been trapped, began to slide free. I twisted and pushed harder. The storm around us roared louder, but the fear inside me began to fade. Something miraculous was happening. We were being set free. The guards were now panicking. I could hear them shouting over the wind, struggling to hold down their tent as it flapped wildly in the storm. One of them screamed that they needed to leave, that it was not safe to stay. I heard the truck door slam and the engine sputter as they tried to start it. Another shouted that the sand was filling the fuel lines. I didn't care what they were doing, I just kept pushing. My hands finally broke through the top layer. I clawed at the sand around my chest and managed to sit up, coughing and gasping for air. The grains fell from my clothes in waves. My muscles were weak, but I turned quickly toward Zaid. He was still mostly buried, though his arms had begun to move. I crawled over, my legs shaking under me, and started digging him out with everything I had left. We weren't going to die here. With every handful of sand I removed, the storm seemed to grow stronger. It was like the sky was fighting for us. I glanced toward Layla, who had managed to free one shoulder. Salma had pushed herself up to her elbows. Rami was already on his knees, helping her with shaky hands. None of us spoke. The wind was too loud. But in our eyes, we all saw the same thing: hope. For the first time since being captured, we could breathe, we could move, we could believe that this wasn't the end. As I pulled Zaid free, he fell forward, coughing hard, his face pale and wet with sweat. I grabbed his hand and helped him stand. We didn't wait. We turned and stumbled toward the rocks in the distance, barely able to stay upright in the rushing wind. Our feet sank in the sand, but we kept moving. The guards were too busy fighting the storm to notice. We had no idea where we were going. We could barely see more than a few meters ahead. The storm turned the desert into a blur of brown and orange, making every direction look the same. Still, we held on to each other, shielding our faces from the sand. My mouth was dry, my throat burned, and my legs were almost too weak to lift. But something inside kept pushing me forward. Layla leaned on Rami, and Salma held onto my shoulder. Zaid walked beside me, whispering verses even through his exhaustion. We didn't speak of a plan. There was no plan, just survival. The storm covered our escape like a curtain, hiding us from those who wanted to see us suffer. I could still hear the guards yelling far behind us, but their voices grew fainter with every step we took. The storm wasn't just freeing us, it was blinding our enemies. God was covering our path. After what felt like an hour, we saw something in the distance. A small, square outline in the sand. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as we got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a hut, made of stone and clay, standing alone between the dunes. It looked old, but sturdy. The door was slightly open, creaking in the wind. We rushed toward it, using the last of our strength. Inside, the air was still. The thick walls kept out most of the wind and sand. It was dark and cool, with only a few dusty blankets in the corner. We collapsed to the ground, coughing, shaking, gasping for air. No one spoke. We were too tired. The storm raged on outside, but inside, it was silent. I looked around at the others. They were alive. Bruised, weak, and broken, but alive. We had escaped. I didn't know how, but we were safe for now. I must have passed out for a while. When I opened my eyes, the wind had started to slow. A dim orange light filled the room from a hole in the roof. Layla was sitting near the wall, rubbing her wrists. Rami was lying flat, eyes closed but breathing. Zaid sat near the door, watching the storm through a crack. Then we heard something, footsteps approaching. We tensed, too weak to fight or run. The door creaked open slowly. A man stepped in. He was old, maybe in his 60s, with a white beard and kind eyes. He wore a long robe and held a small leather bag in one hand. He didn't seem surprised to see us. In fact, he looked like he had been expecting us. He stepped inside and spoke softly. "You don't need to be afraid. My name is Yusuf. I was told to come here this morning, in a dream, and now I see why." None of us responded right away. We were too shocked. I stared at him, unsure if I was dreaming. A dream? Told him to come here? How could that be? Yusuf looked at each of us, then opened his bag and took out a water pouch. He handed it to Rami, who drank slowly. "You've been through something I cannot imagine," Yusuf said. "But God sees you. He sent me here to help." He didn't ask our names or what had happened. He just nodded like he already knew. One by one, he gave us water and pieces of bread from his bag. "You need to rest," he said. "This hut is not safe for long, but it will hold for tonight." We ate in silence. The food was dry and plain, but it felt like a feast. Every bite was a gift. As I drank, my hands trembled, but I could feel strength returning little by little. That night, the storm faded completely. The wind died down, and the stars returned to the sky. We sat around a small oil lamp that Yusuf lit from a match tucked behind his ear. He shared more of his story. "I live near the Dra Valley," he said. "Early this morning, I had a dream. I saw 5 people in the desert, buried in sand. I saw a storm rise and a voice told me, 'Go to the old hut. You'll find them there.'" He looked at us again. So I packed water and food and came. I didn't know if it was real, but now I do. No one doubted him. After everything we had seen and lived through, this didn't seem strange. It felt like confirmation that we had never been alone. That God had planned every step, even the ones we didn't understand. We bowed our heads together in prayer. No long speeches, just quiet words of gratitude and awe. We spent the night in that hut, resting and regaining our strength. Yusuf watched over us like a father. He sang softly in Tamazight, and though I didn't understand every word, I could feel the peace in his voice. We took turns sleeping, listening for any sound outside, but the desert was quiet. Before sunrise, Yusuf woke us gently. "We must leave before anyone comes searching," he said. "Follow me. There's a path that leads to the mountains." We rose slowly, still sore and weak, but willing to walk. Each step away from that place felt lighter. The sun began to rise behind us as we moved toward a ridge in the distance. We walked for hours through narrow paths and dry riverbeds. The journey was hard, but hope gave us strength. Finally, Yusuf stopped and pointed ahead. "There," he said. "Beyond those hills is a hidden village. Followers of the way live there. You'll be safe now." The village beyond the hills was unlike any place I had ever seen. Hidden deep in the mountains near Tasnakt, it was small, simple, and surrounded by dry trees and rocky paths. Yet the moment we stepped into it, I felt peace. Yusuf introduced us to the people quietly. There were maybe 40 of them, men, women, and children, each one with eyes that told stories of pain and survival. Many were followers of Jesus, just like us. Some had fled from Marrakesh, others from smaller villages in the south. There were no loud welcomes or celebrations, only gentle smiles and warm hands offering us water and blankets. We were given a small corner of the settlement near a large fig tree. It wasn't much, a few mats on the floor and a shared bowl of couscous, but it felt like a gift. After everything we had been through, just being able to sleep without fear was a miracle. In the days that followed, our bodies slowly began to heal. The burns on our skin faded, our voices returned, and the sharp pain in our muscles grew dull. But something else was happening too. Our hearts were healing. For the first time in a long time, we could breathe without looking over our shoulders. I spent many hours just sitting under the fig tree, watching the sky and listening to the quiet sounds of the village. Layla began helping in the women's shelter, where survivors of abuse stayed. I watched her gently care for a woman who had been beaten by her husband for reading the Bible. Layla cleaned her wounds, combed her hair, and whispered scriptures of hope. I could see that Layla was changing, not just surviving, but becoming someone stronger. Salma spent most of her time with the children, teaching them letters and songs about Jesus. Her soft voice seemed to calm even the noisiest kids. Zaid was the one who changed the most quickly. Though he was the youngest, he became the boldest. Almost every day, he would walk through the village looking for newcomers. If he found someone sitting alone or looking afraid, he would sit beside them and start talking. He never pressured anyone. He just shared our story. He told them how we had been buried alive and how God had cooled the sand and sent the storm. Some listened in silence, others wept. A few even asked to pray with him. Zaid didn't care about being liked or understood. He simply believed that the God who saved us could save anyone. I began helping in small ways, gathering water, carrying firewood, sharing food. It felt good to serve, to give something back. But deep inside, I still felt unsure. Why had God saved us? Why had he allowed us to live when so many others never made it out? That question stayed with me every night as I lay on my mat. I kept thinking about the moment in the desert when the storm came and the sand loosened. It was not just survival. It had been too intentional, too powerful to ignore. And now we were here, alive and surrounded by others in need. I started praying differently. I no longer asked, "Why me?" Instead, I began asking, "What now?" I didn't have to wait long for the answer. One afternoon, while I was helping Yusuf repair the roof of one of the huts, a stranger walked into the camp. He wore a long brown coat and a scarf around his neck. His face was worn, and he carried a quiet heaviness. When Yusuf greeted him, the man asked if someone named Nabil lived here. I stepped forward cautiously. He looked at me for a long moment, then said something that made my knees go weak. "I buried you in the desert." I didn't understand at first. I stared at him, thinking maybe I heard wrong. But then he said it again, this time softer, with a kind of sorrow in his voice. "I was one of the guards. I was there when they buried you and your friends." My hands began to shake. The memories came rushing back. His face, his voice, the heat, the pain. I recognized him now. He had been the one who tied my blindfold. His name was Tariq. The others heard him and slowly gathered around. No one spoke. Tariq looked down, ashamed. "I couldn't sleep after that day," he said. "When I touched the sand near you and felt it was cold, I knew something was wrong. That night, I had a dream. I saw your faces, not buried in sand, but standing in light." He paused, looking at each of us. "I left the unit. I walked for days. I need to know the God who saved you." The silence that followed his words was heavy. I didn't know what to say. Part of me still wanted to be angry, to ask him why he had done what he did. But when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see pride or defense. I saw regret. I saw a man who had been running, not just from us, but from himself. Rami stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not the only one who's buried something," he said. "We all have." Then he smiled. "But Jesus brings the dead back to life." We invited Tariq to sit with us. Layla offered him water. That night, around a small fire, we told him everything, not just about the storm, but about the peace we had found, the community, the reason we stayed. When we finished, he looked up and said, "I want that peace too." Right there, under the stars, Tariq prayed for the first time in his life. That moment changed everything for me. Seeing the man who once helped bury us now kneeling in prayer beside us made me understand something I had not seen before. We weren't saved just to survive. We were saved for this, for moments like this, for people like Tariq, for those still searching. I realized that God didn't just rescue us from death. He rescued us for a mission. That mission wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet. It looked like sharing a meal, telling a story, praying with someone who felt lost. It looked like teaching a child how to read or holding the hand of someone in pain. The mission wasn't about being strong. It was about being faithful. It was about showing others that Jesus was alive, even in the middle of a broken world. That night, as I lay under the stars with the sound of firewood crackling nearby, I whispered, "Thank you, Lord. I understand now." In the following days, Tariq stayed close to us. He helped Zaid distribute food and joined Layla in the women's shelter to carry heavy baskets. The other villagers were cautious at first, but they saw his sincerity. One day, he stood before the small gathering and confessed everything, how he had been part of the group that tried to kill us and how God had forgiven him. He spoke slowly, with tears in his eyes. "I came to this place expecting judgment," he said, "but instead I found grace." That day, something shifted in the camp. The air felt lighter. It was like everyone finally understood that what we had was not just a safe place to hide. It was a place of healing. A place where broken people became whole. A place where former enemies sat together in peace. From that point on, we didn't refer to him as Tariq the guard. We called him our brother. As the weeks passed, our work in the village grew deeper. Rami began organizing short devotionals each evening by the fire. Salma taught the children Bible verses using pebbles and drawings in the sand. Layla started a small circle with the women, sharing stories of Jesus that brought tears and laughter. Zaid never stopped talking about faith. His boldness touched people in ways we couldn't. And I found my place in simply listening. People came to me quietly, sharing their fears, asking their questions, seeking hope. I didn't have all the answers, but I had one answer that never changed. Jesus was with us. That truth alone became my message. The villagers began saying something that stuck with me. Those who were buried came back to life, and now they feed others. I didn't know who first said it, but it was true. We had been in the ground, but now we were standing, and we had work to do. After Tariq's transformation, something shifted in our hearts. We began to realize that the quiet little village in the mountains could no longer contain all that God was doing. People were arriving almost every week now, men, women, and even teenagers, carrying stories of escape, persecution, and hope. We prayed long and hard about what to do next. That's when we knew the time had come to scatter. Not because we were running, but because we had to go. If the message of Jesus could reach us in the desert, then it could reach others in their darkness too. One night around the fire, we made the decision. Layla and Salma would stay at the mountain settlement to care for the growing number of women and children. Zaid and I would join a group of traveling missionaries who were quietly moving between villages across southern Morocco. Rami, always the brave one, volunteered to guide new believers along the escape routes. Our paths separated a few days later. It was emotional. We had been through so much together: burial, escape, healing. Saying goodbye wasn't easy, but we didn't cry much. Instead, we prayed. Rami hugged each of us and whispered, "We'll meet again, in this life or the next." Then he turned and walked with a small group of believers toward Agds. Layla stood beside me, her eyes shining with both pride and fear. "Don't forget who you are," she said. I smiled and nodded, though my heart felt heavy. Salma gave Zaid a notebook filled with verses written in careful Arabic. "Share these with those who have no books," she told him. Then Zaid and I set out with two missionaries, brothers named Idris and Sami. We traveled on foot, taking the long road toward Ouarzazate. Each village we visited carried its own secrets. Some people had heard whispers of our story. Others had no idea what had happened in the desert. But everyone was hungry for truth. Zaid became our voice. His boldness never faded. In small houses and quiet corners, he would sit with families and tell them what God had done. He spoke about the storm, the cooling sand, and the forgiveness we found. People listened in silence. Some cried. Some were afraid. But others believed. My role was quieter. I often sat with the men after Zaid finished speaking, answering questions, calming doubts. Sami and Idris helped translate when needed, especially in areas where Berber dialects were spoken. We carried no banners, no signs, no announcements, only our story and the word. In each village, we found at least one person ready to follow Jesus. And with each new believer, we formed a small gathering. A home became a house of prayer. A courtyard became a church. We moved slowly, carefully, but the movement was real. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were planting seeds, and they were starting to grow across the land. We heard about Rami's death a month later. A boy from Agds came running to our hiding place just before dawn, carrying the news. Rami had been caught while helping a mother and her two children escape a government raid. The soldiers accused him of spreading foreign religion. He was beaten and executed on the edge of the village. They buried him quietly, without prayer, without honor. My knees gave out when I heard it. I sat on the ground and stared at nothing. Zaid stood silently, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Idris wept openly. Rami had been our leader, our example. His courage had lit the path for us. That night, we gathered in a dark room and remembered him. We sang the song we had sung in the desert, "Jesus, my peace." And we lit 5 candles, one for each of us who had once been buried. One now burned for Rami, who had finished his race. Rami's death shook us, but it didn't stop us. If anything, it gave us more reason to keep going. We traveled through the dusty back roads of Ouarzazate, finding small groups of believers in hiding. In one village, A woman told us she had dreamed of 5 people standing in fire without burning. When she saw Zaid, she said, "You were one of them." In another village, a shepherd boy had heard of the buried ones, a story told by travelers near Marrakesh. We had never been there, but our story had. That amazed me. We didn't have newspapers or videos or any kind of publicity, yet the story spread. People were hearing it, and it was giving them hope. We began to hear the same phrase repeated in different towns. God brought them out of the sand. That became the name people whispered when they talked about us. We never claimed it, but we accepted it. It wasn't our story anymore. It was God's. The underground churches began to grow. In homes and in caves, people gathered quietly to pray and worship. Zaid and I taught using small pages torn from Bibles. Sometimes we had nothing but a single verse. Still, we shared it like treasure. We baptized new believers in rivers at night. We fasted when food was short and prayed when we had no answers. We saw miracles, not just healings, but hearts changing. Men who once hated Christians began hiding them. Women who had never heard of Jesus began telling their children about him. One day, in a village near Skura, an old man came to us and said, "I once watched you being buried. I thought you were mad. Now I see you were alive." I didn't ask how he had been there. I simply said, "We were dead. But Jesus raised us." That's what we told everyone. Not about our suffering, but about his power. Not our courage, but his mercy. Despite all the danger, I never felt alone. Even when Zaid and I had to split up for a while, he went toward Marrakesh, and I headed toward Tasnakt. I knew we were walking the same road. I often thought of Layla and Salma. We had no contact with the mountain settlement for months, but I believed they were still there, still serving. I also thought of Tariq. His face came to mind every time I sat with someone who once hated us. His life reminded me that no one was too far gone for God to reach. Sometimes I missed the safety of the village. I missed the fig tree and the warmth of our fire. But I knew we were not called to comfort. We were called to go. And so, I kept walking. One step at a time. From one house to another, one story to the next. The gospel was moving, and we were simply the carriers of its fire. Months passed. My feet grew tired. My voice weakened. But my heart only burned brighter. I had seen too much to turn back. I had walked through fire and sand, through fear and silence. And I had seen what Jesus could do. One morning, as I sat near a dry well outside a quiet village, I felt a pull deep in my spirit. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, something calling me back. Not to the safety of a place, but to the memory of a miracle. That afternoon, I began the journey back to the desert. Alone. I didn't tell anyone. I simply packed a small bag, carried a worn copy of the New Testament, and followed the sun toward the east. I didn't know exactly where the burial site was, but my feet seemed to remember. Step by step, memory by memory, I returned to the place where death had once tried to claim us. I arrived near sunset. The dunes looked different, softer now. The sand shifted gently in the wind, as if breathing. I walked slowly, searching for the spot. Then I saw it, a circle of stones, placed carefully in the shape of a cross. I fell to my knees. This was it. The place where we were buried. The place where we were supposed to die. But God had written a different story. I sat there in silence for a long time, letting the wind pass over me. I thought of Rami and his brave heart. I thought of Layla's singing and Zaid's fire. I thought of the silence that had once surrounded us and the voice that had broken through it. This place wasn't filled with fear anymore. It was filled with presence. It wasn't just a memory. It was sacred ground. I closed my eyes and whispered the same words I had whispered the day the sand turned cold. Jesus, don't leave me. I stayed at the burial site until the sun dipped below the dunes and the stars appeared one by one in the quiet desert sky. The wind was soft, brushing across the sand like a memory. I sat with my legs folded, my hands resting on the cool ground, and my heart heavy with gratitude. I thought back to the moment we were buried here, when fear sat like a weight in my chest and the sun felt like fire on my skin. But now, everything had changed. This place no longer spoke of death. It spoke of life. It reminded me of what God had done, not only for our bodies, but for our souls. I ran my fingers through the sand, feeling the softness between them. I whispered, "Thank you, Jesus." The desert hadn't forgotten. And neither had I. I knew then that I couldn't keep the memory to myself any longer. The next morning, I began walking toward the village where I was born. The same place I had once left in silence, afraid to be seen or known. The journey took 2 days by foot, crossing dry plains and climbing rocky paths. My body was older now. I moved slower than before, but my spirit felt lighter. As I neared the edge of the village, I recognized the same fields where I used to play, the same old olive trees, and the same scent of dust in the air. But something was different. I heard singing. Not loud, not formal, but familiar. It came from a tree at the far side of the village, near the well. As I got closer, I saw a small group of people gathered under it. They were sitting in the shade, heads bowed, and one woman was leading a quiet song. The tune stopped me in my tracks. It was the same song we had sung when we were buried in the desert. Tears filled my eyes. I hadn't heard that melody in years. I walked slowly toward them, unsure of how they would respond. But as I drew closer, one of the men looked up and stood. His eyes widened. Are you Nabil?" he asked. I nodded slowly. A few others turned and gasped. "We've heard the stories," the woman said. "The buried ones. We've sung your song for years." They invited me to sit with them. I sat under the tree, the same way we once sat in the hidden farmhouse before dawn. I told them everything, how we were captured, how we refused to deny Jesus, how God cooled the sand and sent the storm. I spoke of our escape, the hut in the valley, the mountain village, and the people we met along the way. They listened in silence. When I finished, a man stood up and said, "I want to follow this Jesus too. Will you baptize me?" We walked to the village well. The water was shallow, but it was enough. The man stepped in slowly, his face filled with peace. I spoke the words as clearly as I could, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." When he came up from the water, he was crying. The others began to pray. It was quiet and holy. That well, once used only to quench thirst, had now become a place of rebirth. Over the next few days, more people came to the tree. Some had heard rumors. Others were simply drawn by the peace they saw in their neighbors. One day, a man arrived wearing a plain white robe and a look of nervous curiosity. He was a local officer, one of the very people who used to help enforce laws against Christians. He stood at a distance, unsure if he was welcome. I walked to him and offered my hand. He hesitated, but took it. "I once carried out orders to arrest people like you," he said. "But I've been watching. Something's changing here. I want to understand." We sat under the tree that afternoon. I told him the story again, slower this time. When I finished, he stared at the ground. "If your God could forgive you," he said, "could he forgive me too?" I nodded. "Yes," I said. "He forgave the very ones who nailed him to the cross." That day, he didn't make any promises, but he came back the next day, and the day after. Within a week, he was reading the Gospel of John with the others. That tree, once just a meeting place for villagers, became the first known church in the region. No walls. No pulpit. Just shade, open hearts, and the presence of God. They called it the Tree of Life. I never expected to see revival here, but God always surprises us. Years passed. I stayed in the village, living simply in a small clay house near the tree. My hair grew gray, and my steps became slower. But every morning, I woke to the sound of prayer and every evening to the sound of singing. I received letters from distant places. One day, a young courier handed me a worn envelope. It was from Layla. She was now in Algeria, leading a group of women who had escaped similar persecution. She wrote, "We haven't stopped singing. The song from the sand still lives." Another letter came months later from Zaid. He had traveled across Tunisia and Libya, preaching and planting underground churches. His boldness had never faded. He ended his letter with, "Every time I baptize someone, I remember the moment you pulled me from the sand." I held their words close. We were scattered across the continent, but our hearts were still united by the same fire. One evening, a traveler arrived in the village. He carried a small camera and a soft voice. He said he worked for a Christian organization and had heard rumors about a man who had been buried alive and survived. He asked if I would tell my story on record, so others could hear it. I thought about it. I had told the story many times, but this was different. This would go beyond the village, beyond the mountains, beyond borders. I agreed. We sat under the tree, just before sunset. He pressed record, and I looked into the camera. "My name is Nabil," I said, "and this is what God has done." I told it all, the fear, the fire, the freedom. I didn't speak with fancy words. Just truth. When I finished, the man wiped his eyes. "This will give hope to so many," he said. I smiled. That's all I want. For people to know that he still saves. After the man left, I sat alone under the tree. The sky turned orange, then purple, then dark. I listened to the wind move through the branches, just like it did in the desert years ago. I remembered the sound of our voices in the sand. I remembered Rami's strength, Layla's singing, Zaid's fire, Salma's quiet faith. I remembered Tariq, kneeling in prayer with tears in his eyes. I remembered the moment when the sand cooled and the storm rose. And I realized something. The miracle didn't end in the desert. It had only begun there. It had grown in every village, every gathering, every soul who chose to believe. God didn't just bring us out of the sand. He brought life out of it. The desert had once tried to bury us. Now it had become a garden of faith. I leaned back against the tree trunk and whispered, "You never left us, Lord. Not even once." There are children now in the village who weren't even born when we were buried. They run around the tree, laughing and singing songs they learned from their parents. They know the story, not as a tale, but as truth. Sometimes they ask me, "Were you really under the sand?" I smile and nod. "Yes," I say. But that was not the end. One day, I sat with a group of them and told the whole story again. When I finished, one little girl looked up and said, "God must really love you." I nodded slowly. He does. But he loves you just the same. That's the message I want to leave behind. Not just survival. Not just escape. But love. A love that finds us in the deepest pit, the driest land, the darkest night, and lifts us out. A love that still calls us today, no matter where we are. That is the love I will never stop sharing. I know my time is short now. My steps are slower, and my body aches more with each passing day. But I'm not afraid. I've already seen what comes after death tries to win. I've already tasted the kind of life that death cannot stop. Before I go, I've written down every word of this story for others to read and remember. I don't want it to be lost in time or buried in silence. I want it to live on, like the song we sang in the sand. I don't need to be remembered. But if someone finds hope through this, then it was worth everything. I end my story with the same truth that has carried me all these years. I was buried in the sand, but I rose in the spirit. If God can bring life out of this desert, He can bring hope out of yours. And that, I believe, with all my heart.